September 1, 1939 marked the moment when German forces crossed into Poland, but the seeds of their devastating effectiveness had been planted 2 decades earlier in the humiliation of Versailles. The treaty that ended the Great War stripped Germany of territory, military might, and dignity, creating a nation seething with resentment and hungry for redemption. What followed was not merely a military resurgence, but a complete reimagining of warfare itself, one that would catch the world catastrophically unprepared. The German military had learned lessons in defeat that the victors never grasped in victory. While France constructed the Maginot Line, a monument to defensive thinking, German officers studied their failures from 1914 through 1918. They dissected every battle, every stalemate, every bloody trench that had consumed a generation. The Reichswehr, limited to 100,000 men by Versailles, became a laboratory for military innovation rather than a traditional army. Every soldier was trained as a potential leader, every officer as a potential general. Hans von Seeckt, the architect of this transformation, understood something profound. Small numbers could become an advantage if properly leveraged. Between 1920 and 1926, he created what historians would later call a leader army, where even junior ranks possessed strategic thinking abilities. Secret training programs in Soviet Russia, paradoxically allied with Germany through the Treaty of Rapallo in 1922, allowed German officers to experiment with tanks and aircraft forbidden by Versailles. According to military historian James Corum's research published in The Roots of Blitzkrieg, this clandestine cooperation provided Germany with crucial practical experience in combined arms warfare that Western democracies completely missed. The economic catastrophe of the Great Depression proved to be Germany's perverse opportunity. When Adolf Hitler became chancellor on January 30, 1933, he inherited both a broken nation and a military establishment that had spent 15 years planning for resurrection. Hitler's regime didn't create German military effectiveness, it unleashed it. The rearmament program that began almost immediately wasn't just about building tanks and planes. It was about implementing theories that had been refined in secret for over a decade. General Heinz Guderian emerged as the prophet of mechanized warfare, publishing Achtung Panzer in 1937, which laid out the doctrine of rapid, concentrated armored attacks supported by air power and motorized infantry. This wasn't entirely new. British theorists like J.F.C. Fuller had proposed similar ideas. But Germany possessed something Britain lacked: institutional willingness to completely restructure military thinking around the concept. The Wehrmacht that formed in 1935 represented a radical departure from traditional military organization, with panzer divisions designed for independent operation rather than infantry support. By 1939, Germany had created a military machine unlike anything the world had seen, not necessarily larger or better equipped than its opponents, but fundamentally different in conception and execution. The German soldier carried the same rifle his father had used in the Great War, but he fought within a system that had learned to orchestrate violence with unprecedented coordination. The question wasn't whether Germany would go to war, but whether any nation was prepared for the kind of war Germany was ready to fight. The answer would come with terrifying swiftness in the autumn of '39. May 10, 1940 dawned with French generals confident that any German offensive would take weeks to develop, giving ample time for response and counterattack. By May 14th, those same generals stood in shock as German armored columns reached the Meuse River, having covered ground in 4 days that military doctrine insisted required 2 weeks. This wasn't just speed, it was a complete reimagining of what armies could accomplish, and it rendered decades of defensive planning obsolete in mere hours. The blitzkrieg, lightning war, succeeded not through technological superiority, but through conceptual revolution. German tanks weren't necessarily better than French or British models. The French Char B-1 was actually superior in armor and firepower to most German panzers. The Luftwaffe didn't outnumber the combined air forces of France and Britain. What Germany possessed was something far more dangerous: a unified doctrine that treated aircraft, armor, and infantry as parts of a single organism, rather than separate services cooperating reluctantly. The attack through the Ardennes forest exemplified this integration. Allied commanders had dismissed the region as impassable for armor. exactly what German planners counted on. General Erich von Manstein's operational plan called for 7 panzer divisions to thread through narrow forest roads, emerge at the Meuse, cross the river, and drive toward the English Channel before Allied armies could reposition. The plan violated every conventional military principle about maintaining secure flanks and consolidated fronts, yet it worked precisely because it was unexpected. Stuka dive bombers functioned as flying artillery, responding to requests from ground commanders within minutes rather than hours. Radio communication allowed German tank commanders to coordinate movements in real time, while Allied units still relied on motorcycle couriers and telephone lines that German advances quickly severed. This wasn't about having more radios, though Germany had equipped even individual tanks with them, but about building an entire command philosophy around rapid information flow and decentralized decision-making. The concept of Auftrags tactic, mission-type orders, gave German officers at every level the authority to achieve objectives through whatever means they deemed appropriate. A French or British company commander waited for detailed instructions from higher headquarters. His German counterpart received an objective and the freedom to accomplish it as he saw fit. When communication broke down, as it inevitably did in combat, German units continued operating effectively, while Allied forces often froze, waiting for orders that never came. The campaign in France revealed another crucial element of German effectiveness: the psychological dimension of warfare. Stuka sirens, designed to terrify rather than enhance military function, created panic disproportionate to actual casualties inflicted. Refugees clogging roads disrupted French military movements as effectively as actual combat. German doctrine explicitly incorporated the goal of paralyzing enemy decision-making, creating situations where Allied commanders faced impossible choices and made no choice at all, surrendering initiative by default. By June 14, 1940, German forces entered Paris. What should have been a months-long campaign concluded in 6 weeks, with France, the nation that had stood firm for 4 years in the Great War, surrendering. The campaign cost Germany approximately 49,000 casualties. They inflicted over 360,000 on the Allies. The disparity wasn't explained by courage or equipment, but by the fundamental mismatch between 1914 thinking and 1940 warfare. Germany had written new rules while its opponents still played by old ones, and the result was catastrophic asymmetry. January 1st, 1938 found the German military undergoing transformation that went far beyond simple expansion, as the Wehrmacht incorporated Austria's armed forces following the Anschluss. The German military system differed fundamentally from Allied counterparts, not in technology, but in how it organized, trained, and employed human beings. While Britain struggled with peacetime volunteers and France relied on conscripts serving minimal terms, Germany built a force where every soldier understood his role within a larger operational concept. The German replacement system ensured that units maintained cohesion and effectiveness even during heavy combat. Rather than sending individual replacements to depleted units, the Allied approach, Germany rotated entire formations out of combat, integrated new soldiers while veterans remained to maintain unit culture, then returned the reconstituted force to battle. This preserved the informal networks, shared experiences, and mutual trust that made squads and platoons effective beyond what organization charts suggested. A German infantry company in 1943, despite having suffered casualties, retained institutional knowledge and social bonds that made it far more capable than a paper-strength Allied unit filled with strangers. Training emphasized initiative and adaptability over rote obedience. German soldiers practiced responding to unexpected situations, with exercises deliberately designed to create chaos requiring improvised solutions. Non-commissioned officers received training that in Allied armies was reserved for commissioned ranks. This created depth in leadership. When a German squad leader fell, the most capable soldier assumed command naturally, having been prepared for exactly that eventuality. Allied squads often became ineffective when leaders were casualties, waiting for someone from higher headquarters to tell them what to do. The general staff system, though not unique to Germany, was implemented with thoroughness that exceeded other nations. Staff officers rotated between command and planning positions, ensuring that those who devised operations understood ground realities while field commanders comprehended strategic imperatives. This created shared language and mutual respect between echelons that plagued Allied forces, where staff officers and field commanders often regarded each other with suspicion bordering on contempt. Research by military scholar Trevor Dupuy, documented in his Comparative Studies of Military Effectiveness, concluded that German divisions consistently outperformed Allied equivalents by significant margins even when outnumbered and outgunned, a phenomenon he attributed primarily to superior training and organizational structure. The Wehrmacht also excelled at integrating new technologies and tactics based on combat experience. After-action reports from junior officers reached senior commanders within days, and lessons learned were disseminated throughout the force with remarkable speed. When German forces first encountered Soviet T-34 tanks in June 1941 and discovered their own armor was outmatched, adaptations began immediately. Within months, new anti-tank weapons, revised tactics, and modified training programs addressed the deficiency. This organizational agility, the ability to recognize problems, develop solutions, and implement changes quickly, gave Germany crucial advantages during a war where technological and tactical innovations emerged constantly. The replacement of losses with increasingly younger and less trained soldiers would eventually erode these advantages. But through 1942, the Wehrmacht represented perhaps the most effectively organized and trained military force of the 20th century. Soldiers knew not just their jobs, but why those jobs mattered within larger operations. They possessed confidence that came from realistic training and trust in comrades built through shared hardship. They operated within a system that rewarded initiative and punished paralysis, that valued flexibility over rigidity, and that treated adaptation as essential rather than exceptional. This organizational excellence, more than any weapon system or tactical innovation, explained German military effectiveness during the war's early years. March 17, 1935, witnessed Hitler's announcement that Germany would rearm in open violation of Versailles restrictions, but the industrial mobilization that made German military effectiveness possible had been building less visibly for years. The transformation of German industry from Depression-era collapse to Europe's most formidable war economy represented calculated planning, ruthless prioritization, and exploitation of resources both domestic and conquered. Understanding German military effectiveness requires examining not just soldiers and tactics, but the industrial system that equipped them. Albert Speer's appointment as armaments minister in February 1942 marked formal recognition of principles already guiding German war production. Unlike Allied nations that slowly converted peacetime industries, Germany had designed its industrial base for military output from the rearmament program's inception. Factories built in the mid-1930s incorporated features enabling rapid transition to war production. Industrial managers coordinated with military planners to ensure that weapons being designed could actually be manufactured at scale. This integration of design and production avoided development of equipment that, while technologically impressive, proved impossible to build in useful quantities. The German approach to standardization and simplification evolved throughout the war, but even early on demonstrated sophistication exceeding Allied efforts. The Schmeisser MP-40 submachine gun, introduced in 1940, used stamped metal construction rather than traditional machining, reducing production time by 80%. The MG-42 machine gun, operational by 1942, was designed explicitly for manufacturing efficiency while achieving performance that made it arguably the war's best weapon in its class. German engineers understood that a good weapon produced in quantity beat an excellent weapon available in small numbers. The exploitation of occupied territories provided Germany with resources that enabled sustained warfare despite Allied blockade. By 1940, Germany controlled the industrial capacity of Czechoslovakia, Austria, Belgium, and much of France, adding millions of workers and thousands of factories to its production base. Czech arms factories, particularly the Škoda works, produced tanks, artillery, and small arms for the Wehrmacht throughout the war. French factories were converted to German use, their workers compelled to build equipment that would be used against former allies. According to economic historian Adam Tooze's comprehensive study, the wages of destruction, German war production continued increasing through mid-1944. partly because it could draw on resources from territories stretching from the Atlantic to deep inside Russia. The German synthetic fuel program demonstrated both industrial sophistication and strategic foresight. Lacking natural petroleum reserves, Germany developed coal gasification technology that by 1944 provided roughly 90% of aviation fuel and half of total petroleum needs. The Luna Works, Buna rubber plants, and various synthetic oil facilities represented massive industrial undertakings that, while eventually targeted by Allied bombing, enabled German military operations years longer than access to natural resources alone would have permitted. However, German industrial mobilization also revealed critical weaknesses that would eventually prove fatal. Production remained less centralized and efficient than Soviet or American systems, with multiple agencies competing for resources and authority. The famous German engineering tendency toward overcomplexity meant that weapons were often more difficult to maintain and produce than simpler Allied equivalents. The Tiger tank, formidable in combat, required twice the production hours of a Soviet T-34 and suffered mechanical unreliability that limited operational effectiveness. Strategic bombing, while less immediately decisive than Allied commanders claimed, progressively degraded production capacity and destroyed the transportation infrastructure needed to move goods from factories to fronts. By 1944, despite Speer's organizational improvements, German industry faced insurmountable mathematics. The combined industrial capacity of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union exceeded Germany's by overwhelming margins. German factories could not replace losses at rates that Soviet and American production achieved. The industrial foundation that had made German military effectiveness possible through 1942 increasingly became inadequate for total war against enemies whose factories vastly outproduced German ones while remaining beyond reach of Wehrmacht ground forces. November 9, 1938, found German officers celebrating the success of limited operations that had bloodlessly expanded Reich borders through Austria and Czechoslovakia, their confidence in professional judgment and operational skill riding high. The German officer corps represented a military elite with traditions extending back to Frederick the Great, combining aristocratic heritage with professional meritocracy in ways that produced leaders of exceptional tactical and operational ability. Yet this same corps carried cultural and ideological flaws that would contribute directly to eventual catastrophic defeat. The Prussian military tradition emphasized personal initiative, aggressive action, and acceptance of risk, qualities that served Germany extraordinarily well during mobile operations, but created problems in strategic thinking. German officers excelled at the operational level, planning and executing campaigns like the drives to the Channel Coast in 1940 or to the Volga River in 1942. However, they demonstrated far less capability at the strategic level, where political considerations, economic factors, and long-term sustainability determined ultimate success or failure. The officer corps that could brilliantly execute complex military operations repeatedly involved Germany in conflicts where operational excellence could not overcome strategic impossibility. The relationship between the officer corps and the Nazi regime revealed fundamental moral corruption that went beyond individual evil to encompass institutional failure. While some officers initially regarded Hitler with skepticism, the successes of 1939 through 1941 convinced most that the former corporal possessed strategic genius exceeding their professional judgment. The oath sworn to Hitler personally in August 1934 bound officers to a dictator whose decisions increasingly defied military logic. The infamous Commissar Order of June 1941, directing execution of Soviet political officers, made the Wehrmacht complicit in crimes that violated both military honor and basic humanity. The officer corps that prided itself on professional ethics participated in atrocities that erased any claim to moral standing. Operational planning demonstrated characteristic German excellence within flawed strategic frameworks. The invasion of Soviet Russia, Operation Barbarossa, showcased brilliant operational design hobbled by strategic incoherence. 3 army groups would advance simultaneously toward Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine, destroying Soviet forces through massive encirclement battles. The operational concept worked spectacularly through summer and autumn of 1941, with millions of Soviet soldiers killed or captured, However, the campaign lacked realistic strategic objectives. Germany invaded Russia without adequate logistics for sustained advance, without winter equipment for forces that might not achieve quick victory, and without clear understanding of Soviet industrial capacity to replace losses. Officers who could plan encirclement battles involving millions of soldiers somehow failed to recognize that defeating Russia required political collapse or economic exhaustion beyond Wehrmacht capabilities to inflict. The German officer corps also demonstrated fatal organizational rigidity when confronting Hitler's increasingly irrational strategic decisions. The principle of loyalty that bound the corps together prevented effective resistance to orders that violated military sense. When Hitler forbade retreat and demanded last-stand defenses, officers who recognized the futility of such orders generally obeyed them anyway. The tragedy of Stalingrad exemplified this pattern. Professionally competent officers executed operationally nonsensical orders, sacrificing the Sixth Army because retreat contradicted Hitler's directive despite being militarily necessary. The few officers who did resist, like those involved in the July 20, 1944 assassination attempt, represented a minority, and their failure revealed how thoroughly the regime had captured military loyalty. Individual German commanders achieved tactical and operational successes that military historians study decades later as masterpieces of the art. Erich von Manstein's counteroffensive at Kharkov in February-March 1943 demonstrated ability to transform near catastrophe into victory through bold maneuver. Erwin Rommel's operations in North Africa during 1941 through 1942 showed how smaller forces could defeat larger opponents through superior command. Yet these operational successes occurred within strategic contexts doomed to failure, making individual brilliance ultimately futile. The German officer corps of World War II represented paradox: professional military excellence in service of strategic madness, operational brilliance, implementing criminal policies, tactical virtuosity within doomed campaigns. Their effectiveness made German military forces formidable opponents requiring years and enormous sacrifice to defeat. Their flaws, moral, strategic, and organizational, ensured that effectiveness served goals that could never succeed and methods that could never be justified. June 22, 1941, arrived with Soviet forces deployed forward along the German border, Stalin having ignored intelligence warnings of imminent attack despite information from multiple sources indicating Operation Barbarossa's launch. German success in achieving strategic surprise resulted from systematic deception operations that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of information warfare. Throughout the conflict, German intelligence services, deception programs, and signals intelligence capabilities provided advantages that multiplied combat effectiveness beyond what raw numbers suggested. The Abwehr, German military intelligence under Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, achieved notable early successes despite eventually proving less capable than Allied counterparts. Before the invasions of Poland, France, and Russia, Abwehr agents provided detailed information about enemy dispositions, fortifications, and command structures. The intelligence that guided German airborne forces to capture Fort Eben Emael in May 1940, a Belgian fortress considered impregnable, came from years of painstaking reconnaissance. Commandos knew precisely where to land because agents had photographed the installation and identified critical points requiring immediate neutralization. German signals intelligence capabilities, particularly early in the war, exceeded what Allied forces initially suspected. The B-Dienst, German Naval Intelligence Service, successfully decrypted British naval codes through 1942, providing Admiral Karl Dönitz's U-boats with convoy routes and enabling devastating attacks. The breaking of Allied codes gave Germany information about shipping movements, military dispositions, and even high-level strategic discussions. When Britain changed naval codes in June 1943, ending B-Dienst's access, the impact on U-boat effectiveness was immediate and severe, demonstrating how significantly signals intelligence had enhanced German operations. Deception operations played crucial roles in German military successes, though Germany never matched the systematic deception infrastructure Britain developed. The false radio traffic and dummy installations that convinced Allied intelligence of German strength in Norway in 1940 deterred British offensive operations. The deception preceding the Ardennes offensive in December 1944 achieved surprise despite Allied advantages in intelligence, with German forces concealing the concentration of armies intended for what became the Battle of the Bulge. Radio silence, movement only at night, and exploitation of bad weather that grounded Allied reconnaissance aircraft enabled Germany to assemble a major offensive without Allied commanders recognizing the threat until attacks began. However, German intelligence also suffered critical failures that negated many successes. The Abwehr's assessment of Soviet military capability before Barbarossa underestimated Red Army strength by millions of soldiers and failed to identify industrial facilities beyond the Urals that would enable Soviet recovery. Intelligence about British resolve after the fall of France proved disastrously wrong, with German analysis concluding Britain would seek negotiated peace when Churchill's government never seriously considered that option. The failure to penetrate Allied intelligence regarding industrial capacity meant German planners consistently underestimated the scale of American and Soviet war production. The compromise of German codes represented intelligence disaster, with cascading consequences. British success in breaking Enigma codes through the Ultra program, building on Polish cryptographic work before the war, gave Allied commanders access to German communications at high levels. While Ultra remained highly classified and carefully protected to prevent German awareness of the compromise, it provided information about German intentions, capabilities, and dispositions that shaped Allied operations throughout the war. The precise impact of Ultra remains debated among historians. Some argue it shortened the war by years, others suggest its influence was more limited. But unquestionably, German operational planning occurred with an opponent reading German communications, a circumstance that negated many advantages. German counterintelligence also proved inadequate to security challenges. The Soviet Union ran extensive espionage networks throughout German-occupied Europe, providing Stalin with information about German forces, production, and research programs. The Lucy spy ring in Switzerland transmitted intelligence about German operations on the Eastern Front with remarkable speed and accuracy. German security services, despite brutal measures including torture and execution of suspected spies, never effectively neutralized Soviet intelligence operations, meaning Wehrmacht movements were often known to Soviet commanders before execution. By war's end, Germany had lost the intelligence competition decisively. Allied code-breaking, aerial reconnaissance, and human intelligence provided comprehensive pictures of German capabilities and intentions, while German intelligence about Allied operations became increasingly inadequate. The information warfare dimension, less visible than tank battles but no less important, shifted from German advantage early in the war to overwhelming Allied superiority by 1944. August 1, 1943, witnessed German defenders in Sicily demonstrating how combined arms tactics could multiply the effectiveness of outnumbered forces facing materially superior opponents. One German panzer division, fighting alongside Italian formations of questionable reliability, delayed two Allied armies for weeks through integration of armor, infantry, artillery, and engineers that Allied forces struggled to replicate despite their advantages. This battlefield excellence at tactical and small unit level remained a German strength throughout the war, even as strategic position became hopeless. The German approach to combined arms warfare differed fundamentally from Allied methods, through genuine integration rather than simple cooperation. In Allied armies, infantry, armor, artillery, and supporting elements operated as distinct organizations that coordinated during battle but trained and thought separately. German tactical doctrine treated combined arms as the default, with training exercises incorporating multiple elements from the beginning. A German infantry company conducting attack training did so with actual tanks, actual artillery forward observers, and actual engineers, not representatives or simulated assets, ensuring that when combat occurred, coordination was reflexive rather than improvised. The relationship between German infantry and armor exemplified this integration. Panzer Grenadier units, mechanized infantry, trained alongside tank formations, with infantry commanders understanding armor capabilities and limitations, while tank commanders grasped what infantry required for success. During combat, tanks provided mobile firepower supporting infantry advance, while infantry protected tanks from close-range anti-tank weapons and identified targets. This mutual support, practiced until automatic, made German combined arms teams significantly more effective than equivalent Allied forces, where armor and infantry often worked at cross purposes, each branch blaming the other for failures. Artillery integration showcased German organizational sophistication. Forward observers accompanied frontline units as organic members, not attachments from separate organizations. They understood infantry tactical requirements intimately and could call fire missions using procedures so practiced that responses came within minutes. German artillery doctrine emphasized massing fires rapidly on critical targets rather than distributing firepower across broader areas, creating decisive effects at critical moments. The famous German 88mm gun demonstrated combined arms flexibility, serving as anti-aircraft, anti-tank, and field artillery weapon depending on requirements, manned by crews trained for all roles. Engineer support was integrated into German tactical planning more thoroughly than Allied practices. Combat engineers accompanied attacking forces, providing immediate demolition, mine clearing, and fortification capabilities. The German emphasis on combined arms meant that infantry commanders expected engineers to breach obstacles under fire, assault fortified positions with specialized weapons and explosives, and construct defensive positions when units transitioned to defense. This integration ensured that tactical operations didn't halt waiting for engineer support to arrive from separate organizations. Defensive tactics revealed German tactical innovation responding to material inferiority. As Allied superiority in tanks, artillery, and air power became overwhelming, German forces developed defensive methods that multiplied effectiveness of limited resources. Defense in depth, multiple defensive lines rather than single forward positions, absorbed Allied attacks and created opportunities for counterattacks against overextended units. Anti-tank weapons organized in mutually supporting positions created kill zones that destroyed Allied armor, despite numerical inferiority. Infantry fighting positions incorporated overhead cover protecting against artillery, connected by trenches enabling movement without exposure to fire, sited to provide interlocking fields of fire that eliminated dead ground where attackers could advance safely. The German ability to conduct counterattacks distinguished their defensive operations from static resistance. Even when forced into defensive posture by Allied material superiority, German commanders sought opportunities to strike back, using mobile reserves to hit exposed flanks, disrupt assembly areas, or destroy supply lines. These counterattacks, carefully planned and violently executed, forced Allied forces to maintain strength throughout their positions rather than concentrating at breakthrough points, slowing offensive momentum and inflicting casualties disproportionate to German strength. Small unit leadership remained a German advantage throughout the war. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers exercised initiative and accepted responsibility to degrees uncommon in Allied forces, where junior leaders more often waited for specific orders. A German squad or platoon separated from higher command continued executing its mission using tactical principles understood by all members. This decentralized effectiveness meant that German units remained dangerous even when communications failed, command structures disrupted, or situations developed in unexpected ways, circumstances that paralyzed Allied units more reliant on detailed direction from above. December 16, 1944, saw German forces launch their last major offensive in the West through the Ardennes forest, achieving tactical surprise and initial success that demonstrated German military capabilities remained formidable despite years of cumulative losses. Yet the Battle of the Bulge also revealed the essential futility of German military effectiveness when confronting overwhelming Allied material and manpower superiority. By late 1944, Germany faced enemies whose combined resources exceeded German capacity by margins that tactical skill could not overcome, rendering German military effectiveness ultimately irrelevant to strategic outcomes. The mathematics of attrition warfare proved inexorable. Germany mobilized roughly 18 million men for military service during the war. The Soviet Union mobilized approximately 34 million, the United States 16 million, Britain 5 million. Even accepting that German soldiers were individually better trained and more tactically proficient, a conclusion supported by casualty exchange ratios and operational results, Germany could not kill enemy soldiers faster than enemies produced them. Each German casualty was increasingly difficult to replace with soldiers of equivalent quality, while Allied nations, particularly the Soviet Union and United States, absorbed horrific losses and continued fielding effective forces. Industrial capacity disparities became insurmountable by 1943. American factories produced roughly 297,000 aircraft during the war. German factories produced approximately 119,000. Soviet factories manufactured over 107,000 tanks and self-propelled guns. Germany produced roughly 67,000 armored vehicles. The United States alone outproduced Germany in virtually every category: trucks, artillery pieces, small arms, ammunition, ships, and supplies. German factories, even operating at maximum efficiency under Speer's rationalization programs, could not match combined Allied output. A German tank destroyed could be replaced only with difficulty. An American or Soviet tank destroyed was replaced almost automatically from production vastly exceeding losses. The strategic bombing campaign, while controversial regarding its effectiveness, progressively degraded German capacity to wage war. Beyond destroying factories and oil production facilities, bombing disrupted transportation networks essential for moving materials from mines and plants to where they were needed. By 1944, German industry suffered chronic shortages of coal, iron, and raw materials, not because supplies didn't exist, but because bombed rail networks and destroyed bridges prevented delivery. The Luftwaffe, increasingly grounded by fuel shortages, could not defend German airspace against Allied bombers operating in daylight with fighter escort, further accelerating industrial degradation. German military effectiveness had rested on advantages that eroded systematically. The qualitative superiority of German training became less significant as the war progressed, and replacement soldiers received abbreviated instruction. The tactical flexibility enabled by Auftragstaktik tactic required junior leaders of high quality. As experienced officers and NCOs fell, replacements couldn't maintain the same performance levels. The combined arms integration that made German forces so effective required resources that became increasingly scarce: ammunition for artillery, fuel for tanks, trucks to transport infantry, spare parts to maintain equipment. By 1945, German tactical doctrine designed for mobile warfare couldn't be executed because divisions lacked mobility, making sophisticated concepts irrelevant. The final campaigns revealed German forces reduced to tactical competence without operational or strategic hope. Units fought skillfully, but hopelessly, delaying rather than defeating, slowing rather than stopping. The defense of Berlin in April-May 1945 demonstrated that German soldiers retained courage and tactical ability until the end, inflicting heavy casualties on Soviet forces despite inevitable defeat. That effectiveness made German defeat more expensive for the Allies, but could not make it less certain. Germany's military effectiveness in World War II represented a study in the limitations of tactical and operational excellence when divorced from strategic wisdom. German forces, superbly trained and organized, fought campaigns designed by leaders who had involved Germany in wars it could not win. The same officer corps that executed brilliant operational maneuvers served ideologies that guaranteed international opposition impossible to overcome through military means alone. Tactical proficiency enabled Germany to conquer most of Europe by 1942, but couldn't address the fundamental strategic reality that Germany lacked resources to defeat the combined forces eventually arrayed against it. The question, why was Germany so effective, finds answers in training, organization, doctrine, and leadership. The more important question, why German effectiveness ultimately didn't matter, finds answers in strategy, resources, and the mathematical realities of total war against enemies whose combined strength exceeded Germany's by overwhelming margins. German military effectiveness made World War II longer and bloodier than it might have been with different opponents, but could not alter outcomes determined by factors beyond tactical battlefield skill. The Wehrmacht's effectiveness became a cautionary tale. No degree of military proficiency can compensate for strategic failure, moral bankruptcy, or wars undertaken against enemies whose combined resources make defeat mathematically inevitable regardless of battlefield performance.